Variants are one of the most important features in Figma because as product designers, most of the components that we're building have the ability to exist in different states, even if it's as simple as default and hover. As a result, the vast majority of the components that I'm designing have some set of variants associated with them. So this lesson is all about designing variants in the most effective way possible. Let's dive in. In order to really understand how we're going to go about the best way to build variants, we need to first spend just a couple minutes understanding the problems that are associated with doing it the wrong way. So first, we're going to look at the pros and cons of creating variants that are all unique components. And what I mean by that is if we open this up here, you can see that there is no parent wrapper for this content. Each variant is entirely unique. So this is an instance of this component here, and you can see we've overridden the text and the icon. So right now, this is set to disabled. And what I'm going to do is decrease the padding on this disabled variant to 32 pixels. So you can see that automatically reflects in the instance, which is great. But as soon as I change this state to default, the overrides are only happening at this individual level, which might not be that big of a problem if there's only 3 buttons, but what system has 3 buttons? It's more likely that there'll probably be 50. And so it's important to figure out a way to tie these buttons back to a single source of truth so we're not wasting our time making the same changes more than once. Now, what if we duplicated our first variant? And that way, we'd have all of these buttons tied back to the top variant here. So let's test that out. Using our previous example, I could change the padding to 32 pixels, and you can see that reflects everywhere as well as the instance. So we're off to a great start. But here's the issue. As soon as I change this to disabled, what happens? I lost my text and my icon overrides. And that's because if the source of truth lives within this variance menu itself, you're not going to be able to keep your overrides no matter what. So these are the 2 wrong ways to do it. Now let's look at the right way. And the right way is all about using base components to build out your variant set. And all that means is you have one component that lives outside of your variance menu that powers each individual variant. So if we crack these open, we can see that inside each one is a base lesson container. All right. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to go ahead and build these really quickly so you can get a sense of the process. And I've also written out the steps here. The first thing is we're going to create this base component, which we have. And the naming structure that I typically like to follow is .base and then the component name. So in this sense, it's the lesson container. And the reason we start off with a period is any component that starts with a period is not included in our library exports. So we won't have to worry about importing these base components. So this is the naming structure. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate it twice. Now, once I have these 2 versions here, you can see they're both instances of the base. I'm going to turn them into main components, and I'll name them accordingly. Let's say this one is default, and this one is hover. Now, once we have 2 main components, we can combine these as variants. And it's very important to have duplicated this base component twice instead of doing this. Duplicate, and then duplicating this second one. If you do that, it will break. But if we duplicate this base component twice and then turn those instances into main components, that's the right way to do it. Okay, so now we have our component here, which I will call lesson container. And if we look at our list here, we have just finished step 4, where we've hit combine as variants. And at this point, I can create all of the rest of the states. But let's crack these open really quickly and we can see the base lesson container exists in both of these. What's going to happen if I create a new variant, either by hitting this or hitting Command D? I have variant 3, and if I open it, it automatically pulls from the base container. So as soon as you have 2 components that pull from that base, any new component that you add to your variants is going to include your base by default automatically. So all I have to do now is spend just 2 seconds and I can kind of create my states here. And you'll notice that in this base component, I've actually included a bunch of hidden layers. And this is everything that I might need throughout my designs. So what that allows me to do then is I can hide and show things based off of each individual state that I need to create. So for something like the default, this is all I need here. And then for this hover, I'll keep it the same. Let's hide these. But then for this completed, I want to make sure that I'm showing this little completed icon and the overlay right here. And so everything that I need to be able to create my states has to live in this base component. And I could keep building these out and create all of the states here, which I need to be naming: completed, active. And another good practice is all of the overrides that I'm applying, I like to apply them at the base level so that my variant level actually doesn't have any styling associated with it. And this isn't 100% necessary to have this method succeed, but what happens is if you're combining conflicting styles at the parent level and the base level, sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to keep track of. So as a general principle, I do all of my styling at this base level. So if I wanted to change this backdrop to 100%, for instance, and replace all of my neutrals with my dark, you can see everything that I'm doing is happening at this base level. Once you're done, your end result is going to look something like this. You'll have your base component. You'll have your variance that defines every state that that base component can take. And then you'll have the actual instances that you're using inside of your designs. And the nice thing is that everything is tied back to this individual source of truth. So for instance, let's say that I want to increase the padding of these. Watch how this evolves. With one click, I'm able to radically change my design and have that reflect everywhere. Even if I'm importing this component into a bunch of different files, everything is tied back to this individual base component, which means that you only have a single knob to turn whenever you want to make wide sweeping changes throughout your designs. Now let's look at a few other examples. As you can see, I'm using variants for pretty much every component I create, even if there are only 2 states, default and hover. When I'm designing for web, pretty much everything has some kind of effect or state change whenever I'm interacting with the component. So whenever I make a new component, right away, I'm going to turn it into a base component and create my first 2 variants, no matter what, even if I don't know exactly what that hover state is going to look like. Most of the time, my starting point is I'll have 2 things that look exactly the same, and I'll figure out my hover state later. I just know that it's going to exist at some point. So my starting point is always to create that first base component. And again, the naming that I'm going to use pretty much every time is base, and then the component name, and then this is just the component name by itself here. And you don't have to use cards like this to organize it, but I think it's really helpful. And I actually do this in all of my designs where I'll have the base component above the actual component itself, and then I'll have the name and this space for documentation below it, where I'm talking about the different states, maybe calling out some edge cases or bringing attention to things that might be easy to miss for developers. And then the last other thing to note is Again, see how this row includes a bunch of information in case this item is an event? I'm not actually defining that here because this might be a little bit of an edge case, and that's okay. I'm still going to include it in my base component so that when I actually need to use this component here, I can really easily unhide the event information in the case that that is the state that it's taking on. And that's it. It might seem a little bit clunky at first, but these 5 steps that I've outlined here, I do for every single component that I create, and they become totally second nature really, really fast. I promise it's gonna make your life a lot easier once you get in the habit of using base components to power all of your variants.